Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Mage, Errant, Book 1, Into the Labyrinth. Chapters 5, 6, 7, 8. 5, 6, 7, 8. Lessons, Silence in the Library, Training, and Lunch. In these chapters, Hugh finds out he's got friends and genuinely doesn't seem to know what to do with that information. Oh, Hugh, buddy. You've had it rough. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Dan for commissioning this episode. Dan is here in the chat. What's up, Dan? So, these chapters are really interesting because y'all know that I said last time how excited I was for Hugh to face off with Rhodes again. And I said that because I was sort of expecting, and forgive me, I'm going to adjust my mic a little bit here. It's kind of in my face right now. I was thinking that Hugh was going to have a little bit more in the way of control of his magic by the time he ran into Rhodes again. And that turns out to not actually be the case. And it was on my mind because we don't run into Rhodes again until I believe the beginning of chapter 7 or end of chapter 7, maybe beginning of 8. And I'm sitting here realizing he's not really learning other magic or like ways to control what he does or anything like that. So he's really not going to be better prepared to defend himself. And it really just goes to show how very isolated my thinking can be. Because the concept of him having backup and friends who can help defend him didn't even enter my mind. And I think that's because I wasn't really, he didn't know Talia and, I'm forgetting the other student's name. I am so sorry, ladies. But he didn't know them when they got selected to be in the class with him, or the apprenticeship with him. Sabae, thank you, Dan. And so I think that I was expecting him to never really be around them the same way because I forgot their classes wind up being aligned and they're doing the same things at the same times so that they have the same free period in the afternoon. So I was still imagining that he wasn't really going to be near them for a lot of the day like he hadn't been before. And what a delightful turn of events. Like this, the difference in him suddenly being able to defend himself. And instead it's, I have friends to help this time, is so much more profound somehow. I think what it is to me is that anytime that you've got a bully who is physically picking on a character, and that character is eventually able to physically stand up for themselves, it's not like that's not a victory. Of course you want to see that, but it does give it sends the message that to stand up to a bully, you have to match their exact behavior in some ways, and that if you don't learn how to fight, then it's sort of like you're bringing the thing on yourself. There's and I know that's not really what's meant to be taken from that, but there is, if you guys, I unfortunately probably spend too much time in the old Facebook comment sections on public posts, and it is remarkable how many people will still be blaming kids for being bullied and be like, well, this is why parents should teach their kids to fight. This is why parents should teach their kids to stand up to bullies. And there's a very popular sort of conception out there that if you get in a bully's face, then he will back down. And like, sometimes it really depends. Some bullies, that's not going to work. So anyway, I feel like, especially in America, we have such an emphasis on the individual and on the concept of being able to do for yourself and not depend on other people. And as much as I can like understand in a way where that comes from, when you come down to it, it's horseshit. The whole reason that our civilization has moved forward at all is because we have evolved to begin to try and take care of one another. And that, unfortunately, has been sort of shit on in our country. And you can see where that has gotten us in as of lately. So for him to not have to fight because other people who have abilities that he doesn't have his back is just somehow very moving. It really like got to me. And it made me so happy that he doesn't even like understand what's going on in the moment. Like, he doesn't see Sabae coming up behind Rose. He doesn't understand. He doesn't understand that Talia has kicked Rose in the balls. He just sees Rose stop dead with this look on his face. And then it's described to us like that Talia is there and you're realizing what happened. So it's all such a shock. And even with this, he assumes, one, that they don't consider themselves his friends necessarily. And two, that they are going to be judging him for looking like for being a coward. And Sabae has to be like, bruh, what? This dude is huge. He can use magic, has 3 affinities, training since he was a child, and he had 2 friends who are also known to be like gifted with him. Nobody expected you to fight that guy. Are you kidding me? And I love this. Like, Hugh genuinely is just like so embarrassed. And it's not until Sabae is like, man, if you had tried to fight him, I would have been like, is he serious? Like, there's just a real sense here of how much Hugh misviews himself. He really sees a lot of his own actions through the lens of like the worst possible scenario and judges himself really harshly. And it is, there is something about this that I find to be, and this is something that has been a criticism of, and I'm going to make the Harry Potter comparisons because that is what I do. You guys understand. But fuck JKR because she is a TERF and I don't fuck with her shit anymore, but I am still going to talk about it. There have been a lot of people, including myself, who have had some criticisms of the fact that Harry in the Harry Potter books is able to sort of stand up for himself and able to engage in a way that feels sort of confident. And there's just a general vibe of like, where did this come from? If he was raised by family who mistreat him, neglect him, shit all over him, from when he was able to comprehend what was happening to him, it is unlikely that he would have this level of clapback to Malfoy or confidence to approach Ron or the variety of like things that he does in the first book that make him kind of stand out. And here I feel like we're seeing a much more accurate idea of what it would be like to be raised the way that he was, because the description that we get from Hugh's upbringing is really similar to Harry Potter's. He's raised by an aunt and uncle who, use him to do chores, but always talk about how he's using up resources and they're not even like spending money on him. They're giving him hand-me-downs and all this stuff that like they obviously deeply resent him and remind him all the time of like what it takes to raise him and that they shouldn't be in this position and that he's like lucky to have them. And to me, it feels a lot truer to the way human beings react to that kind of treatment. When you are a person who is constantly reminded that everything about keeping you alive costs money, it is going to worm its way into your brain until you don't have any confidence because you feel like your existence is a burden on people. And that's a really difficult thing to shake. I only had that like a tiny bit and it really got into my head. And I know folks that had that hung over their heads constantly. And this is one of the problems where I just like, I get very salty about parents who sort of act like their kids owe them something because they put a roof over their head and clothing on their back. And I'm like, yeah, because you decided to have a child and that child did not choose to be here. So you don't get to use the fact that you raised them like you should as a weapon. Like they don't have to be grateful to you for that. They can understand that they're fortunate and that they may have the privilege of being raised by a parent who gave a shit when others don't, but that's certainly not something to like throw in their face. So anyway, I just thought that this was like really a different take on what a character who is presented as being like much more I feel like Harry Potter is talked about as being very ordinary in a general sense, but I feel like honestly, when you look at the way that he behaves at certain times, he isn't. He does some things that are a little bit more daring, and it doesn't really jive with what we know about the way he has been treated. And Hugh feels a lot more accurate. I mean, he's out here cowering, and I use the word cowering, and I don't mean it to be coward, but you know what I'm saying. He is crying, not infrequently, and hiding, like actively finding a place to live where he isn't going to be found by people so that he can just kind of not make himself a target. And generally this seems like, and later on we hear about how incredibly shy he is around them. He rarely speaks, and to the point where like they start to sort of tease him about it. And he does speak up a little bit then, but they really have to like pull it out of him. He isn't somebody to chime in or speak up on his own without a lot of prodding and a lot of like rolling out the red carpet and making it clear, we're listening, this is safe. And I don't blame him for that at all, because I was a kid, believe it or not, who did not like speak up when I was in school, things like that. I really kind of kept quiet a lot of the time because I was observing others and trying to understand how to be. And I think this is an advantage that sometimes a kid who might be, I now understand I was neurodivergent, but I didn't have siblings to look at and sort of get the ways to like just pull off being a cool person. So I had to learn it in school. And that was a lot of just watching and envying a lot of the time, to be honest. And, I feel like Hugh is sort of in that position as well. He's just sort of like shrinking back, and he is a keen observer, but he feels like anytime he opens his mouth, he's going to fuck up. So, Miss T says, if it's the victim's fault, then I can avoid being one somehow. That's exactly it. It all comes down to feeling like if we can act like there's something that the victim can do, then we can somehow not be one. And unfortunately, that is just not how it is. Like, sometimes there are things you can do to prevent bad things happening to you, but the idea that you are in complete control of what happens to you is a joke. Dan says, how realistically Hugh's emotions and personal struggles are written is one of the reasons I like Mage Errant so much. Ms. T says, hard agree. I'm supposed to be working and I can't put the book down, and it's because of this. Yeah, so I'm just like, I'm really interested because Hugh has been... I have mentioned before how sometimes I can be a little impatient with characters who are very meek, or the one that I always bring up with this is and don't kill me guys, but Bella Swan in Twilight. She is somebody who is always like afraid to take action, really, and she will, anytime anybody like offers to do anything for her or buy her a gift, she is so like, I can't accept that, in a way that always felt really like, girl, get over yourself. Like, you are making so much bigger a deal out of this than you would if you just accepted the thing. And that has always been sort of played as like, this is what makes the character a good person, that they're not greedy, that they're not demanding. And I guess, but there are ways to write that. And I feel like Hugh is the way to write that. He is somebody who, the reason that he is afraid to speak up feels legitimate. His fears around that are based in something. They're based in the way he was treated and the way he was spoken about and to. And there's not like, you know, it was always weird to me that Bella was going to just be like, I don't want to be any trouble. I don't want to do. And then she would go out and do these absurd things, taking these risks and putting other people in these positions. And I'm just like, I feel like you're really prioritizing the wrong things here. Hugh, not even thinking to ask his friends for help. And when they do help, feeling ashamed. That makes a lot of sense. So anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's begin at chapter 5. So I love this so much. Alliston says something about second lesson, and he was like, what? He says, I'm not actually keeping track. Hugh thought better of responding to that. So you wanted to know about the Aether, Alliston said. Not really, Talia said. The Aether is like the ocean. And I really like this. Talia just keeps on kind of interrupting. And finally, Sabae is like, hey, can you just stop? Like, I know you think you're being cute and funny. Maybe you don't want to learn. Leave. We would like to learn, and you're annoying. Knock it off. I was like, fucking amen. We all know a person like this. And I won't lie. Occasionally I am the person like this. Who just like is the main character, you know, in their mind. And they just like keep making it about themselves. Just shut the fuck up. It's fine. Just shut the fuck up. And he is talking about how it's like the ocean and moves like water, and it moves freely. So if you want to get it to do something, how do you do that? And Talia says, force it to move. And he's like, have you ever tried forcing the ocean to do anything? You have to forge channels for it to flow through. Your body does this naturally, absorbing and storing mana from the Aether. Spell forms may then be used to take your stored mana and utilize it. As your body absorbs mana from the Aether, it drains the mana around you. Then, at a speed that depends on the density of the Aether nearby, it fills back up like a pond filling in the hole left by a bucket. Which is a really funny way of saying that, a pond filling in the hole left by a bucket, because it happens so quickly when you pull a bucket of water out of a pond that you don't think of it as being a hole that's filled in, but that is essentially what it is. And this is when Hugh asks, is it possible to channel mana directly from the Aether instead of letting it refill your mana reservoirs? And Alliston is like, it is technically, but it's really hard and it doesn't really do any good for you. Like, there's no benefit to that. And I was sort of like mentally bookmarked that as something that might actually have a benefit that they don't know about yet. Or I don't know. I don't know if that's anything, but it's an interesting concept here because it's once again, to talk about Cradle, there is Aura and then there is Madra. And Madra is manufactured by taking in Aura and basically processing it within your body. And what's sort of different is that the processing of it takes more effort in Cradle than it does here. And the attunement is essentially in Cradle what your core would be. So if you are following a certain path, and in that you really only get the one. There's tons of techniques within that path, but you get the one. Here, being able to have more than one is also like very interesting to me in terms of the way that Madra is stored in Cradle being in one core, and he's describing mana reservoirs. So it sounds like it's a multiples thing, the way that Linden has two cores. But that sounds to me like the mana, like aligning with your attunement, is the body processing it to align with whatever element it is that your attunement focuses on. Does that make sense? I think I'm getting that. So anyway, he then asks them, do you know where the ether comes from? And again, Talia, everyone knows that one. And I'm just like, girl, you have got to catch on. Stop saying that. And he says, it's the death of the universe itself. The apprentices were silent at Alliston's proclamation. The first thing that popped in Hugh's head was that Alliston really, really enjoyed dramatic pauses, which is a little bit of a thing that is mentioned later on as well. And look, I have got to say, if you are going to be a good teacher, I think you kind of have to be a bit of a drama queen. Like, it's not to say that there aren't good teachers out there who aren't, but I feel like you've got to have a flair if you want to keep people's attention during like a lecture. It's just kind of, you got to have your audience focused on you, you know? So that makes sense to me. So he says, the universe is wearing down. The slow weathering of the fabric of the universe is what generates ether. It's a waste product of the dying of the universe. So a product of entropy, which is really interesting. And he is like saying, we're going off to the library. You're going to get access to like some restricted stuff. And he questions them each on their progress with what he gave them for homework the night before. He asks Sabae about the mana channeling techniques. And she's like, the stuff that I'm reading requires mana like at such huge density that it would be hard to control even without the difficulties I already have. And he's like, yes, actually, this was a fashion. And I loved this because it makes a lot of sense that magic would have like trends. You know, everything, there's trendy ways of doing stuff in virtually every circle. There was a brief fashion of casting overpowered, uncontrolled spells in the decades after the fall of the Ithonian Empire. It was supposed to display your primal nature or some such ridiculousness. I'm going to need you to start practicing those techniques immediately. And he doesn't elaborate on this. He just moves on. And Sabae is like, what? So I'm assuming that he's sort of wanting her to lean into what feels like a lack of control. And instead of trying to restrain herself, maybe this will help her with pushing outward beyond what it is that is causing her to have so much problems with like spells that are at a distance. Just a theory. Then he asks Hugh about like the contracts and stuff. And he pretty much shoots down every single one of these creatures that Hugh has like named. And then says, you're on the right track though. And Hugh was like, what does that mean? But he doesn't get a chance to ask. And I am curious because it sounds like he already has an idea of what he wants Hugh to do. And he's just trying to get Hugh there. And I'm like, I understand you wanting him to find the answer himself. But also, if you are very clearly just directing him towards something, this is a very Athenish thing to do. And I am curious where he's going with this. And then he asks Talia about what he had her read. And she's very resentful because it was a children's story about burning bad dreams away from children with like a dream fire and helping them sleep better without nightmares. And when she's like sharing that she's kind of frustrated by this, he says it's a start. A start to what? To being a battle mage. You'd be wasted as anything else. And he just keeps walking and does not answer her. Again, very dramatic. So, Talia calls him Al, and I was like, this bitch has the audacity, I swear. I do like her, don't get me wrong, but she is quite annoying in her way. While I prefer that you not address me as master, I'll have to decline being called Al. She does it again later anyway. So he begins to talk about dream fire, dream attunements, dream manifestation. And we find out later that people who have dream attunements are actively discouraged from pursuing them if they have any other option. It is like, I mean, the description that we're given is that a lot of students who pursue it actually die. And I wasn't ready for that. I was thinking it was going to be simply like looked down upon because it's not a physical like skill, because I didn't really understand what dream attunement looked like. It turns out you can use it in the physical world, but it's actually just really difficult to control, which makes it super dangerous, and therefore students fucking get killed by it, which I just wasn't thinking that was going to be the stakes we were playing with here, so that is worrying. So let's see. Dream fire can be used to alter and manipulate the dreams of a sleeping person. But meddling with the dreams of others won't be possible for you. Your tattoos prevent you from channeling dream mana to actually affect the dreams of others, unless you wish to make your target dream of fire. So, I suppose I'll be training you to purge nightmares from children. The second use is for illusion. It's much harder to craft illusions with dream attunements than light attunements, but it is quite possible. Dream illusion often seem less solid than light-based illusions, but they're far, far more powerful. They can actually hold an element of solidity to them, which leads to the third use of dream manifesting fragments of dreams physically in the world. It is a powerful, dangerous technique and one only usable by the most powerful and focused dream mages. Normally, it would be at least a decade before you could even attempt it. And when she's like, well, then why am I doing it? He's like, you have those tattoos. And she's like, wouldn't that make it more difficult? Yes, with a single exception. Fire. And Talia is like, a word? So yeah, she starts like fucking around with Dreamfire here. And that is a pretty, like, the thing that's getting me here is how kind of obvious this seems once he's pointing it out. And I'm just like, the fact that everybody was so ready to give up on her and how simple the answer kind of turns out to be if you just go in a different direction. But that's often how it is, isn't it? But like, you get the runaround from a bunch of people who just kind of don't want to be bothered with an actual challenge. And then you find out what the thing is and you're like, that's it? Why couldn't you have just fucking like put any effort in at all, and we would have gotten here ages ago. So he's giving Hugh at this point books about the theory behind creating like magical contracts. And he's like, it is very important, but it is a little bit boring. And then books on the basic theory behind spell form construction. I doubt you'll be able to simply start putting less mana into most of your spells. You spent the earliest, most critical part of your magical development having to pump entirely too much mana into every effect. So we'll need instead to give you different spell forms that can handle the larger mana flow. I could give you a simple list, but in the end, that would leave you very inflexible. And this is when Hugh says, I'd be happy just being normal. Merely being normal is hardly something to be happy about. Instead, we're going to make sure you can improvise spell forms on the fly so you can have a spell for any occasion. Which I really do like. I'm very curious about how this is going to... I want to know really what it comes down to is I'm seeing Rhodes as like a big bad at this point, and that might not be accurate. But I keep thinking about things in the context of wanting Hugh to be able to defend himself and wondering what it is that Rhodes is learning, because I am wanting, obviously, for Hugh to be ahead of him in everything. So here's hoping that whatever it is Hugh learns here, he is going to be more flexible than Rhodes. And then he starts talking to Sabae about formless casting. The practice of casting spells without a spell form. It's faster, more powerful, and has a nasty tendency to result in spells that go horribly, horribly wrong. Especially once they've gone more than a few feet away from the caster. Sound familiar? So you're telling me that we're going to solve my inability to cast spells at a distance by learning a way of casting spells that makes it even harder to cast spells at a distance? Nope. We're not going to have you cast spells at a distance at all. Sabae looked like she was about to explode at him. And I was like, girl, same. Unfortunately, thanks to your personal story, which you don't want shared, there likely isn't much hope of you ever learning to use spells at any significant range. We are instead going to teach you to become an effective close quarters combat mage. And she is like, I don't see how that's going to work. And he's like, of course you don't, because I know what I'm doing. And you don't know. And as for there not being any close quarters combat mages, I believe Artur Wallbreaker would be surprised to hear it. Artur Wallbreaker, we meet his son later, has dual iron and stone attunements. He channels them together to create a nigh unbreakable suit of armor around him during battle, as well as massively empowering that oversized enchanted hammer he carries everywhere. While he can use his attunements at a distance, he very, very rarely does so, as it drastically reduces the effectiveness of his armor and his hammer. To use his mana the way he does, he uses the second technique I'll be having you read about, mana layering. And then he mentions how, in addition to all of this, they are going to be getting a lot of physical training. When we go into the next chapter, all of them go over to this like table in the library and they begin reading. And finally, Sabae slams her book shut and looks around and is like, y'all, are we really just going to like chill like this reading and act like the others don't exist? Finally, they begin to tell their stories. And I will say that Talia really got on my nerves with calling Hugh a sheep herder, and I appreciated that she eventually apologizes, because I don't need anybody up in here who is using the same language with him that is used by Rhodes. And also, it's really funny that she is so salty about how everybody sees her like country as being barbarian and assume that she's illiterate, when she is doing the exact same thing to Hugh. That's not to say that that isn't believable, because it fucking is. But girl, for real. Just like literally stop and take a second. Talia isn't real introspective. I think that we have learned, which makes sense that she is from like a fire mage family. She is really somebody who like is, she has a tendency to lash out. I'm just saying. So we find out what happened with Sabae. Her mother was supposed to marry this guy. There was an arranged marriage. She eloped with a healer. And essentially the point of the arranged marriage was to combine the like power of two mages of the same affinity. And because she like goes off with a healer, it fucks up the like plan they have for their lineage and what kind of mages they are going to produce from then on. So Sabae winds up with this like mixture of being able to deal with like storms and weather, but because healing magic is something that is done in close quarters and it's rarely necessary to use at a distance, usually the fact that you can only use it in close quarters is fine. It's no big deal. But because of the combination of abilities she has, it's a real problem to have like storm powers and not be able to use them at a distance. And she's describing like this, growing up and that they didn't have a lot, but they had enough and she never really wanted for anything. And then this terrible illness called the Blue Death began to sweep over everything, and people would die as if they had hypothermia. And many in my family died as well, and they finally reached out to my mother once more. For a time, my mother resisted, thinking they only wanted her back because my father had died. But something had broken in her with my father's death. We were welcomed back with open arms. I was 8. And she's like, they were nice, they were really, they tried to act like we had been there forever, but I didn't fit in. It was difficult. My mom had a really hard time, and started to take contracts to do work far away. So I didn't see her and was left alone. And then once my affinities manifested, they at first were pretty excited. And then they began to see that the close quarters thing was going on, and they didn't know what to do with me. And they blamed my mom because of her going off with my father and essentially polluting the purity of the magic that I could have had. And they're not entirely wrong. That's kind of what the problem was. So they sent me off here, and she says, no school has ever had the patronage of our clan before, and I hope you understand I don't mean to be arrogant when I say that it is of considerable worth. I am the first Cayan Das ever sent for schooling in the magical arts outside of our family, and likely the last. Not, in truth, that I am much of a Cayan Das. Since I arrived, however, the teachers, unable to come up with a simple solution, have distanced themselves from me. Some students tried to befriend me, but only for my family's reputation and wealth. A few have tried to teach me healing, but healing is what ruined me as a storm mage, and I will not deepen my family's shame by learning it. And Talia says, I bet it's going to feel good rubbing your powers in their face in a few years. And Sabae is kind of taken aback, and then she sort of smirks a little bit. And I really, what I find interesting here is the fact that she is so resistant to learning the healing. It's she refers to this as deepening the shame. I wonder if you're able to use it, though. Is it gonna be deepening the shame? If you're able to control, it feels like, yes, they blame her mother for getting involved with a healer because of what effect it had on her abilities. But if you find a way to make that doable along with the ability that they wanted, I can't help but feel like maybe that shame will fall by the wayside. People get very open-minded when they think they can, like, use something, you know? So then we go to Talia's story. And essentially, Talia was a little monster. Her family was very fiery, unsurprisingly, in personality. And she is like, we weren't versatile, but we don't have to be. Fire fucking does what it does, and it is nothing to fuck with. And her mother was a complete badass, more powerful than her father. And I love this so much. In the end, what cost her the position was two things: her tiny stature and her unquenchable temper. She hated my father for years after that. Only after he'd proven himself in battle time and time again did she allow him to court her. I love this energy. Good for you, bitch. That is the way. And all of her brothers and sisters are... Actually, she says, I'm the youngest of seven children. Each and every one of my brothers is a powerful fire mage. So I guess she only had brothers, now that I'm reading this. Yeah, because my parents had long wanted a daughter. That's right. So she is, like, assumed, because the rest of her family followed this certain path, that she is going to be a fire mage. And so they give her these tattoos that are hugely risky and not done often, but they are just so certain. And they're also, like, the most intricate type. Like, they're designed in a certain way that it's a very sort of ostentatious choice that has a ton of pride in it. And then when it turns out that's not her attunement, it is kind of embarrassing for them, you know? And so they had me tattooed before my gifts began to manifest. My parents had the elders design me the most elaborate, powerful tattoos our tribe had ever attempted. And then my gifts did manifest. Bone and dream. My gifts were useless, and my father was furious. He thought my mother must have slept with a man of a different tribe. And eventually, they are able to confirm that she is indeed her mother's daughter, but her father's daughter, but her mother makes him sleep with the goats and dogs for weeks. And that is good energy. I appreciate it. I just like her mom. She sounds like a pain in the ass, but in a way that I would enjoy having on my side. And he says that they, like, her family all traveled different places, as she put it, looking for answers. Which, that right there, like, just on its own, when who you are fundamentally is seen as a problem that needs to be solved, that you have to find answers to, that sucks. That's not a great place to be, you know? And she says that finally that they go to Skyhold, they agree to take her. Upon arriving, though, I found myself ignored and dismissed by teachers and students alike as a useless barbarian. Many even thought of me as illiterate, even when I showed them I can read. It seems the faculty here thought my brother had exaggerated, and that my problems were easily solved by anyone not a foolish barbarian. When it proved otherwise, they turned away rather than face their own shortcomings. And yeah, that sounds right to me. Just being like, oh, of course they don't know how to fix this thing, because they just don't have the kind of civilized education that we have. And then it's time for Hugh's story. I don't have any mages in my family. We pride ourselves on not having any. There were 400 people living in and around Cedar Vale, so the standards weren't impressive. When I was 10, our house burned down. My father carried me out, but when he went back for my mother and baby sister, the roof collapsed, which is brutal. My father's brother and wife took me in. They were sheep herders and had 8 children already. They hardly spent anything on me. They dressed me in hand-me-downs. They put me to work with the sheep, and I was willing, but they never bothered to teach me anything or help me, and I've always been small. They made it very clear that I was useless, and when my cousins and I argued, my aunt and uncle would never take my side. We lived far out of town, so there weren't other kids to play with, and I ended up spending most days out wandering in the woods. They never meant to be cruel or neglectful. They were just too busy to spare much thought to me. Having me out of their hair most of the time was a blessing. The instant my powers started manifesting, they shipped me right off. And my aunt and uncle made it clear I wasn't welcome back, and they haven't written since. Since I got here, no one wants to be friends with a country bumpkin who can't do the smallest piece of magic right. The only thing I'm good for is as the butt of jokes. A few teachers tried to help me, but until Alliston came along, they all gave me up as a waste of time. And I love this so much. They finally get him to look up because he's telling them all of this without making eye contact. And when he looks up, Talia looks furious, and he thinks that she's going to yell at him or something. And then she says, "Your family isn't worth the water they drink. Anyone who would treat their own blood like that, in need, are honorless snakes, and they deserve to get sheared with their own sheep. Though I reckon it's probably hard to tell the difference." And he just starts laughing. He never expected that they wouldn't be scornful of him. And the fact that she's angry on his behalf never entered his head. And as he starts laughing, Sabae starts laughing. And then eventually Talia starts laughing. And later on, when Alliston comes in, they're on the floor. Or at least Talia is. And I just really loved this moment, sharing stories, especially when you have friends that are a part of this that I really appreciated was when Hugh tries to qualify the way he's treated and say they never meant to be cruel or neglectful. This is such a real thing when people are mistreated and they make excuses for the way they've been mistreated because they don't want it to seem as if they're implying somebody is just a straight up monster demon. They don't have to be a complete monster demon to have mistreated you. You you don't have to be saying that. And it's just a real reaction that I have also seen in myself when talking to a therapist about issues with my dad. And then I would start to be well, it wasn't all bad. He would do these good things. And she would have to stop me and be why are you bringing that up right now? You don't need to do that. You can be angry at him and talk about the things that he did without needing to balance it out in the conversation. And, it's just kind of a reflex. You want to defend people that you still do feel like you're indebted to, even if it doesn't really make sense. Dan is saying it's Alliston, not Alliston. No offense, Dan, but I don't like the ALUS, Alluston. I don't know. The audiobook, he doesn't say it like that. Unless he does, and I'm just not picking it up. But Alluston. Alluston? Is it the emphasis on the second syllable? I gotta admit, I don't like it. But maybe that's just because I'm thinking of it as Allison. Which I would have no problem with. Taking a name that already exists and just sticking another letter in it is kind of a foolproof way to just make fake fantasy names. And I am always okay with that. Dan says, it's a long U, I thought, though I haven't listened to the audiobook. Okay. And I'll confess, I don't love the narrator for the audiobook. I think he's pretty good in general with doing voices and stuff, but he has a tendency to use the same intonation over and over with every sentence delivery. And it gets so that you start to kind of inadvertently tune him out. So I have been trying to read the actual text instead. But I will pay more attention. But I'm not like, is there a pronunciation guide somewhere? Because I know some authors do that, but I didn't look. So that might also help. So, okay. Then we get into chapter 7, and he is just really struggling with staying awake during classes because they're getting put through their paces. There's a lot of physical training. He is just exhausted, and he has Talia and Sabae like nudging him awake in class and stuff, which he does for them as well. And he is reading through these books and finding out more about the different monsters, basically, that he could potentially team up with. And there are some of these that sound so crazy. A 40-foot-long serpent made entirely of venomous mists made solid. It only appears on moonless nights in the jungles of southeast Ithos, and its victims take hours to die inside its stomach, unable to escape, although their screams make it out just fine. No, thank you. Has anybody seen Nope? Because this was giving me Nope vibes, and I would like to say, in response, Nope. Then a hive mind spanning millions of spiders. Their webs completely cover huge portions of the Aeto forests in Sarnassus. In the depths of Tetragnoth, I think that's how you say it. Tetragnoth's web are supposedly found a number of incredibly rare plants in high demand by alchemists. Few make it out alive from this forest. But burning down the woods to clear out Tetragnoth would also burn the valued plants, and Tetragnoth shows little interest in expanding its territory, so it's tolerated more than most similar threats. And we find out that there's like a lot of magical spiders in this text, and also that the text changes, evidently. So it's kind of like a Wikipedia. But personally, like, I know a lot of people have issues with spiders, and I'm not going to try and pretend that like a very large spider wouldn't be hugely scary. They are. But I've always been kind of like a fan of spiders. They're just so strange. And really, they're on our side. You know, they want to like eat the bugs and keep them out of our homes. They're here to do work that I approve of. So I would be all about going for a spider team up, personally. I consider myself to be on the same side as spiders and as bats. Anything that's going to eat mosquitoes and moths and keep them away from me, that's an ally as far as I'm concerned. Of course, these guys probably are much larger and would go after bigger prey. Then there is a Naga Lich and a dragon, and there's a bunch of stuff. At one point, he comes across a description of a demon, and he immediately kind of like freaks out. And I was sort of wondering to myself, like, you know, I don't know what the deal is with demons in this universe, so I'm curious about that, despite the fact that I know he doesn't want anything to do with that, and I respect that. I can't help but kind of be like, but what about that, though? So then we have the encounter with Rhodes, and since I am almost out of time, I have spent enough time talking about that, but I do have to say, Sabae basically like punches him and he goes flying because she is using her ability and like controlling an air current. So Talia and Sabae are talking about the way that she did this. First, Talia is like, I thought you couldn't do magic at a distance. And she says, I wasn't. I built up wind around my fist and released it when I struck, and it just naturally flowed in the direction of the strike. Before, it would have dispersed wildly in all directions. This time, it just followed the strike. And I really like that because this is what we're talking about with like being able to do something at a distance, but with like close-up magic. And also this was a like, what is it called? Formless magic. So she made this up like on the spot, basically. So that's cool. And they start talking about what they should call it. And Sabae wants to call it a wind strike. And Talia wants to call it a gust punch. And I feel like it's pretty clear wind strike is the better name out of the two. But it's also, I am certain, kind of played out in fantasy. That sounds like something that would be used a lot. You could do better. At one point, Hugh chimes in and he says gust strike. No, gust strike doesn't work. I think that's probably what they're going to wind up going with, but I don't like it. 2 STs in a row, gust strike. It's too hard to say. Wind strike flows better. Gust punch sounds more like ridiculous, which sort of works for Talia's personality. But you could do like any number of, what about if we're not, let's say, what's a thesaurus for wind? Well, you could do tempest. My instinct is tempest tossed. So you call it tempest toss because that's just like tempest tossed is a phrase that exists already. So if you call it tempest toss, I feel like that works pretty well just on the face of it. Or you could do something like squall strike, or squall slam. Slam is also a fun one just because of the way that it's just the impact of, the slamming idea with air is, I don't know, that feels evocative to me. So yeah, you could do that. I just think that those two options are mid, and we can definitely do better. Just saying. This is also the sort of thing that, like, I can only imagine if you are a fantasy author and you're coming up with these names, how sidetracked you must get trying to come up with them, because it would just completely consume half my day, and I wouldn't get anything done because I'd be so absorbed with trying to come up with a name. So I have very little time left, so I'm just going to talk about chapter 8 here, where they wind up meeting Godric, who is the kid whose father took him as an apprentice, the son of Arthur Wallbreaker. And he is really affable and just hasn't got a mean-spirited bone in his body, as it's put, or even a less than joyously friendly bone. And Hugh thought people that friendly were exhausting, which I do love that. Like, you can simultaneously appreciate that and also just be like, man, it's tiring though. I get it. I really do, Hugh. And this dude is here to just like ask if they will be part of his team for this labyrinth, like, I can't remember what it's called, that they all do at like midsummer, I think, or at the summer solstice. And it's weird to me that this isn't mentioned at all as a thing until he is bringing it up here. But from the way Hugh reacts, it seems like he didn't know about it, which is also strange. Like, I don't understand why it comes as a surprise, because the choosing didn't come as a surprise. And I would assume that this stuff would be publicized as a thing that we need to start thinking about if everybody needs to have a team, But anyway, we find out that Rhodes tried to get Godric on his team and like came at him with this really, I already have you energy. And Godric was like, yeah, you know what? I'm a pass. And Rhodes is really, really salty about it. So he must be quite talented if Rhodes was immediately just zeroing in on him. And he not only has like stone, he has steel instead of iron. And he has a third affinity, which is scent. And I am all about this. That is a weird one. And it is the kind of thing that I feel like people really underestimate the power of scent. And it sounds like something kind of lame. But honestly, as somebody who, my sense of smell is really good. And I think that's part of why I'm very good at cooking. It is remarkable how much smells can make or break my day. And I know that part of it is just that I am more sensitive than a lot of people, but I can, like, there are scents that will send me into a migraine almost immediately. They will ruin things. Owen has an incredibly sensitive gag reflex when it comes to smell. And he, the other day, was bringing the dogs some food outside, and he was bringing them canned food, which if y'all have ever dealt with canned dog food, you know how nasty that shit can be. And we had just gone out to eat, and he was going out the back door with this tray of wet food, and it just hit him the wrong way, and he wound up vomiting all over the carport just from the smell of dog food. And that is not the first time a bad smell has caused him to literally vomit. He will gag in a way that feels like he is about to vomit really frequently. It's just something that, like, it's a liability, honestly. And considering his family, like, owns and runs a janitorial service, and he has to do that for work sometimes, I am surprised that he's able to get through it. But he says he doesn't deal with gross stuff all that often. But yeah, smell, that is just really, I feel like something that people would dismiss a little bit and then be like, oh, word, once they are on the receiving end of it. And we find out that Talia's family doesn't fuck with that, because if you are good enough at it, you can cause that smell to stick and stay with people for like more than a week. And that's torture. And he is able to enhance the scent of Hugh's soup. And even though when Hugh like eats the soup, he's like, smells better than it tastes, but it does still taste better, because scent is a huge part of taste. And there's just no way to make something smell better and it not also affect the taste at least a little bit. It's just a huge, huge part of it. This is part of why when I make like lattes or cups of tea and I put them in one of those sealed like tumblers to keep things hot, if I put the lid on, and it took me so long to understand what was going on, I would take a sip and be like, why doesn't this taste as good as usual? And it was because the lid kept the scent of the drink from reaching my nose. So I was only experiencing the taste of it, which was not the same. So now when I do that, when I take drinks out of it, I take the lid off, because otherwise I'm just kind of like, this isn't really anything. So I'm real curious about how we're going to see that used. That seems like it'd be something fun. So yeah, first years delve into the Labyrinth below Skyhold for their final. They're only permitted to explore the first level, which is fairly safe. They need to do it in teams of 4. And Godric's like, there are 4 of us. And Talia's like, oh, you were planning this from the moment you sat down. And he's like, maybe. And everyone looks at Hugh and he says, all right, fine, I guess. Godric seemed to take that as words of the highest praise and clapped Hugh on the shoulder. Knew you'd come around. We still need to ask me dad and your master, but reckon they'd be fine with it. Hugh rubbed his shoulder ruefully. He was fairly sure he was going to bruise. And that is the end of chapter 8. So we have got chapters 9 through 13 next time. And I just wanted to mention, because Dan had gotten in touch last time, the Jewel of the Endless Erg and then A Traitor in Skyhold both have been commissioned next. So yeah, we are locked and loaded and really ready to go. So Dan says, I was 6'1" in 6th grade. I relate to Godric. Jesus Christ. Your poor teachers. I can only imagine just looking up at your 6th grade student like, what am I supposed to do with you? I had a kid like that. I remember in 7th grade, I think, and he was like 6'3", and his name was Ephraim, but everybody called him Moose. And it really felt right. He was just too big. He was just so big. Like moose. It's just, moose are so big that you're like, that's not right, is it? When you see a photo of them. But yeah, Godric seems delightful. So I'm looking forward to seeing more of him. All right, time to wrap up, but thank you guys very much for hanging out with me. Thank you, Dan, for commissioning this. Appreciate you a lot. Until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.